The door closed behind her. The singing outside faded to a murmur. The laughter of the crowd, the crude songs they had been shouting for hours, all of it suddenly muffled by thick Roman walls. Lucia stood in the atrium of a house she had never entered before tonight. She was 14 years old. Her hands were trembling. The saffron veil that covered her face was damp with tears she had been hiding since the procession began. And she was not alone. 7 people stood watching her. An elderly woman in ceremonial robes, a physician with instruments laid out on a cloth, 3 female slaves holding basins of water, her new husband, a merchant twice her age, and in the corner, covered by a dark fabric, something she could not yet see.
Something no one had warned her about. The elderly woman stepped forward and gripped Lucia's wrist. Not gently, not reassuringly. The grip of someone who expected resistance. "The public ceremony is complete," the woman said. "Now begins the private ritual. Now you will learn what it truly means to become a Roman wife." This is the story Rome tried to bury. The wedding night traditions that ancient historians barely mention. That the Christian Church spent centuries destroying. That modern scholars still struggle to discuss openly. What happened to Roman brides behind closed doors was not a celebration of love. It was a legal procedure, a property inspection, a ritual of submission performed before witnesses who could testify in court.
And at the center of it all stood a wooden statue that would haunt Lucia's nightmares for the rest of her life. To understand what happened to Lucia, you need to understand what Roman marriage actually was. We imagine Roman weddings the way Hollywood shows them. Beautiful ceremonies, flowing white dresses, 2 people joining in love. But this image is a fantasy constructed over centuries of deliberate forgetting. In Rome, marriage was not primarily about love. It was about property. The Latin term was conventio in manum. It means coming into the hand. A woman passed from her father's legal ownership to her husband's. Before the late Republic, this transfer was absolute.
A husband held the same power over his wife that he held over his slaves, including, theoretically, the power of life and death. Think about how Romans handled any valuable property transfer. When you bought land, witnesses observed the transaction. The property was inspected, documents were signed, boundaries were verified. Everyone involved needed certainty about what was being exchanged. Romans applied this exact logic to marriage. The bride was the property being transferred. Her virginity was the guarantee of value. Her fertility was the resource being purchased. And Roman law demanded that all of this be verified before the transaction was complete. This was not metaphor. This was legal requirement.
A marriage was not valid until consummated. The consummation had to be witnessed. The bride's virginity had to be confirmed by medical examination. Each requirement generated corresponding rituals. Rituals that made perfect sense within Roman legal logic. Rituals that would horrify anyone with modern sensibilities. The day had begun beautifully enough. Lucia had worn the traditional flame-colored veil, the flammeum, that marked her as a bride. Her hair had been arranged in 6 braids, exactly as custom prescribed, parted with a spear point to symbolize her submission to her husband's authority. The sacrifice at the temple had gone well. The sheep's entrails showed favorable omens.
Her father had signed the contracts, transferring her from his legal control to her husband's. She had spoken the ancient words that every Roman bride spoke. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The phrase meant she was no longer herself. She had become an extension of her husband. Her identity had been legally erased. Then came the procession through the streets of Rome. This was supposed to be the joyful part. Torches lighting the way, musicians playing, crowds gathering to celebrate. But the songs the crowd sang were not what Lucia had expected. They were obscene, graphic, describing in explicit detail what would happen to her body that night. Young men shouted suggestions that made her face burn beneath the veil.
Old women cackled at verses that seemed designed to humiliate. These were the Fescennine verses, and they were mandatory. Romans believed crude songs drove away evil spirits. The more embarrassing, the more powerful the protection. But Lucia noticed that her mother was not laughing. Her mother had wept while arranging her hair that morning. Her final words had been a whisper. "Whatever they require of you tonight, do not resist. Resistance only makes everything worse." Lucia had not understood. She thought she was simply nervous about being alone with a man for the first time. She did not know that she would not be alone at all. Marcus Petronius lifted her over the threshold of his house. This was tradition.
A bride must not stumble entering her new home. The gesture was also symbolic, a reminder of an older time when women were carried into their husbands' houses whether they wished to enter or not. The door closed, and Lucia saw what was waiting in the atrium: 7 witnesses. The elderly woman they called the pronuba, the physician, the slaves, and in the corner, that draped object she could not identify. The pronuba's grip tightened on her wrist. "You must greet Mutinus Tutinus," the pronuba said. "You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." She led Lucia toward the draped figure in the corner. With trembling hands, Lucia pulled back the cloth.
What stood beneath was a wooden statue, carved with anatomical precision, shaped into the form of a phallus. But this was not a small amulet, like the ones children wore around their necks to ward off evil. This figure was nearly 4 feet tall, and it was positioned on a seat clearly designed for someone to sit upon it. The pronuba began explaining what Lucia must do. Mutinus Tutunus was Rome's god of fertility and sexual initiation. His cult was ancient, predating the Republic itself. Every Roman bride, before her wedding night, was required to sit upon his wooden image. Not symbolically, not briefly. The ancient sources are explicit about what this ritual involved.
Saint Augustine, writing in the 5th century, described it with outrage. Roman brides were made to sit upon the shameful member of Mutunus before consummation with their husbands. He used the Latin word insedere, which means to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius, another church father, provided even more graphic details. Lactantius called the practice so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. These were hostile Christian sources, yes, but earlier pagan texts confirm the same practice. Varro, the great Roman antiquarian, mentioned Mutunus Tutunus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that clearly implied physical contact. The stated purpose was seeking divine blessing for fertility.
The actual purpose was something darker. It was preparation, breaking down resistance before the real consummation occurred. It was demonstration, proving absolute submission before witnesses. It was conditioning, teaching a virgin bride to accept what was about to happen to her. And it was performed in front of everyone. The pronuba guided Lucia's body into position. The witnesses watched. Her husband watched. The physician waited nearby, ready for what would come next. Lucia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant. She understood what the obscene songs had been preparing her for. She understood what being a Roman wife actually required. She could have refused, in theory, but refusal meant disgrace for her family.
Nullification of the marriage contracts. Return to her father's house as damaged goods that no respectable man would ever marry.
It meant proving that everything she had been taught about duty, honor, and womanhood was a lie. She did not refuse. After the ritual with the statue, slaves washed Lucia in basins of scented water. The washing had religious significance, purifying her after the encounter with the god. But it was also practical preparation for what came next. The physician approached. This examination was not optional. Before any wedding involving significant property, a respectable Roman bride underwent medical verification to confirm her virginal status. The examination was documented.
The documentation became part of the legal record. Roman medical texts describe the techniques with clinical precision. There is no ambiguity about what was involved. There is no way to make it sound less invasive than it was. The examination before the wedding established a baseline. The bride was confirmed as intact, as belonging to no other man. Now, after the ritual with Mutinus Tutinus, the physician performed a second examination. This verified that the ritual had been completed, that her physical state was consistent with the earlier examination, that she was prepared for consummation. All of this occurred in front of witnesses, whose testimony might be required if any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged.
What strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions is not just the invasiveness, it is the casualness. The Romans did not view these procedures as traumatic. They were simply necessary steps in an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings were irrelevant. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures. After the examinations, Lucia was led to the bedchamber. The room had been prepared according to tradition. The marriage bed was positioned for visibility from the doorway that would remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided light. The pronuba took her position near the entrance, where she could observe everything that happened.
Slaves waited in the corridor for when they would be needed. Marcus entered. The pronuba spoke the ritual words. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated according to the laws of Rome. Let witnesses verify the completion. What followed took several hours. The pronuba observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction when Marcus seemed uncertain, ensuring that the consummation was completed in ways that would satisfy legal requirements. The door remained open. Sounds carried into the corridor. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public, part of a verification ritual designed to ensure that no aspect of the property transfer could later be disputed.
At dawn, the physician returned. He performed a final examination. This confirmed that consummation had occurred, that the bride was now physically changed in ways that marked her transformation from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronuba provided formal testimony about what she had witnessed. The legal transaction was complete. Lucia was now a Roman wife. For 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Generation after generation of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework. They passed their knowledge to their daughters in whispers. They prepared them for what was coming. They told them not to resist. The system perpetuated itself because everyone accepted its fundamental premises.
Property must be verified. Transfers must be witnessed. Women are the medium through which families continue. The logic was internally consistent. It was also monstrous. The end came not from Roman reform, but from religious conquest. When Christianity transformed Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought different premises. If women had souls equal to men, they could not be treated as property. If marriage was a sacred mystery, it could not include elements the church considered obscene.
If modesty was a virtue, the entire apparatus of witnesses and examinations was offensive. The Church did not simply end these practices, it erased them. Statues of mutinous Tutinus were smashed or buried.
Describing wedding rituals were removed from libraries. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed. The pranuba's role was transformed into something purely ceremonial. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings had actually involved was lost to everyone except scholars studying fragmentary sources. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered flower petals replaced the uncomfortable reality. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. In the hostile descriptions of church fathers, in the embarrassed references of Roman legal texts, in archaeological evidence that only makes sense when you understand what it was designed for. We cannot recover the voices of the women themselves.
Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Their experiences were not considered worth recording. Their feelings about their own bodies were not relevant to the histories and legal texts that men produced. We know what was done to them. We do not know what they thought about it, but we know enough. Lucia lived another 40 years after her wedding night. She bore 5 children. She managed her husband's household. She fulfilled every duty expected of a Roman matron. She never spoke about what happened to her that night, not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged. What was there to say? It was tradition. It was how things had always been done. It was what being a Roman wife required.
Her silence was not unusual. It was universal. And perhaps that silence is the most disturbing part of all. Not the rituals themselves, horrific as they were, but the fact that an entire civilization accepted them as normal. That millions of women endured them without anyone thinking to question whether they should exist at all. Rome is supposed to be the foundation of Western law and culture. We celebrate Roman achievements. We study Roman philosophy. We admire Roman architecture. But this was also Rome. Legal sophistication alongside systematic dehumanization. Civilization alongside brutality. Progress alongside practices that should never have existed. The women who experienced these rituals were real. They lived. They endured.
They were silenced. 2,000 years later, the least we can do is remember and never forget what tradition can be used to justify.